In the spring of 1976, Japanese craftsmen traveled to a small town in the Texas Hill Country called Fredericksburg. They carried tools and materials for a project that had been years in the planning. The town had one claim to the wider world. A man named Chester Nimitz had been born there in 1885. He had grown up to command the largest naval force in the history of the United States and had spent 4 years destroying the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had been dead for 10 years. They had come to build him a garden. The garden was funded by Japanese donors, many of them shaped by the war, and built by Japanese craftsmen as a gesture of reconciliation on the grounds of the museum honoring Nimitz. It would become one of the most extraordinary monuments of the 20th century, not because of its size, but because of what it meant. The people of a defeated nation had chosen to honor the man who had defeated them. He never knew they were coming. He never saw what they built. His name was Chester Nimitz. He had commanded the largest naval force in the history of the United States, destroyed the Imperial Japanese Navy across 4 years and 4,000 miles of ocean, signed the instrument of surrender on the deck of the Missouri, and then walked away from all of it without writing a single page of memoir. And the people he had defeated flew halfway around the world to build him a garden. Not because he had beaten them, because of what he did after. This is that story, and it starts in a shipyard at Yokosuka on an afternoon in the fall of 1945, when Nimitz walked up to a rotting battleship and gave an order that no one expected. On the morning of May 27, 1905, the sea between Japan and Korea was covered in haze. Visibility was poor. The water was grey. The wind came from the southwest, and it carried with it the kind of dampness that settles into wool and wood and bone and does not leave. Somewhere in that haze, moving northeast at 8 knots, was the Russian 2nd Pacific Squadron, 38 ships. They had been at sea for 7 months. They had traveled 18,000 miles from the Baltic, around the Cape of Good Hope, through the Indian Ocean, past Singapore, and up the coast of China. They had not stopped for proper repairs. They had not stopped for proper rest. Their hulls were fouled with marine growth. Their engines were burning fuel that had been loaded at coaling stations where the quality was poor and the supply was uncertain. Their crews were exhausted in a way that goes past tiredness into something closer to resignation. The man commanding them was Vice Admiral Zinovy Rozestvensky. He was 56 years old. He was tall, broad-shouldered, known for a temper that could fill a wardroom. He had been given the fleet because there was no one else to give it to. The 1st Pacific Squadron had already been destroyed at Port Arthur. Russia needed its navy in the Pacific, and the only navy it had left was the one anchored in the Baltic, 7 months and half a world away from where the war was being fought. Rozestvensky had taken it. He had taken the good ships and the bad ships, and the ships that should never have been sent. He had nursed them through tropical heat that warped their decks and winter storms that cracked their fittings. He had watched morale disintegrate slowly the way iron disintegrates in salt water, not all at once, but in layers, 1 day at a time, one failed coaling at a time, one rumor at a time. By the morning of May 27th, his fleet was a procession of exhausted men on exhausted ships, heading into a strait that the enemy had been studying for months. On the other side of that haze, waiting, was Togo Heihachiro. Togo was 57 years old. He was not a large man. He was not a loud man. He had spent 7 years of his youth in England, learning naval science from the country that had built the greatest navy the world had ever seen. He had come home to Japan and applied what he had learned with a patience and a precision that his opponents consistently underestimated. He had been watching the strait for weeks. His intelligence told him that the Russian fleet would attempt to pass through the Tsushima Strait to reach Vladivostok. It was the shortest route. It was the most obvious route, and Rozhestvensky, with his fouled hulls and his exhausted crews and his 7 months of accumulated breakdowns, did not have the fuel or the time to take a longer one. Togo positioned his fleet and waited. He waited the way a man waits who has done everything he can do and knows that the next move belongs to the enemy. His ships were faster. His crews were rested. His guns had been calibrated. His coal was good. Every advantage that 7 months of travelling had taken from the Russians, 7 months of preparation had given to the Japanese. When the Russian line appeared through the haze on the morning of May 27th, Togo was standing on the bridge of the battleship Mikasa. He stood exposed to enemy fire in the old style, because the men on the ships behind him needed to see where their admiral was. He had learned this from Nelson, not the tactic, the principle, that in the moment before the guns begin, what a fleet needs from its commander is not a signal. It is a presence. He ordered his fleet to turn across the head of the Russian column. What followed was not a battle in any sense. That word suggests an exchange between equals. It was a destruction. The Japanese fleet crossed the Russian line and poured fire into ships that could not maneuver fast enough to respond. The Russian formation broke apart. Ships burned. Ships listed. Ships went down with their colors still flying because no one was left alive on the bridge to strike them. By the end of the second day, 21 Russian ships had been sunk. 6 had been captured. The rest were scattered across the sea, or limping toward neutral ports where they would be interned for the remainder of the war. Approximately 5,000 Russian sailors were dead. The Russian Navy ceased to exist as a fighting force in the Pacific in the space of 48 hours. It was the most decisive naval battle since Trafalgar, and unlike Trafalgar, the victor survived it. Togo stood on the bridge of the Mikasa through the entire engagement. The ship was hit repeatedly. Officers fell around him. He did not move to cover. When it was over, he gave his report to the Emperor in a message that contained a single sentence of self-assessment. He said the result was less than satisfactory because several Russian ships had escaped. That was the man. Now, here is the part most people have never heard. 3 weeks after the battle, Vice Admiral Rozhestvensky was lying in a naval hospital in Sasebo, Japan. He was 56 years old. He had been found unconscious aboard a destroyer after the battle. Shrapnel wounds. He had been transferred to a Japanese hospital ship and then to the hospital on shore. He would survive. He would eventually be repatriated to Russia. He would spend the rest of his life answering questions about a defeat that could not really be answered, because the answer was that he had been sent on a mission that was impossible before it began. Togo came to see him. No cameras, no press, no official delegation. The greatest naval commander alive, by any measure available at that time, walked into the hospital ward in Sasebo, sat down beside the bed, and took the Russian admiral's hand. According to the accounts that survive, Togo said this: "Defeat is the common fate of a soldier. There is nothing to be ashamed of in it. The great point is whether we have performed our duty." One old officer speaking to another old officer in a hospital room in a country that had just crushed his fleet, not performing for an audience, not delivering a message for the newspapers, just saying what he believed to a man who needed to hear it. That visit lasted a few minutes. It echoed for decades. And across the water, on a battleship making port calls in the Western Pacific, a 20-year-old American midshipman was about to meet the man who had made it. Chester Nimitz was 20 years old in the summer of 1905. He had graduated from Annapolis earlier that year, 7th in his class. He was assigned to the USS Ohio, a battleship working its way through the ports of the Western Pacific on the kind of long deployment that the Navy used to finish the education of its youngest officers. He was still learning, still watching, still in the early part of that quiet apprenticeship that turns a young man in a uniform into something more than a young man in a uniform. The Emperor of Japan was throwing a garden party. It was a victory celebration. The war with Russia was over. Japan had done something the Western powers had spent a long time telling themselves was not possible. An Asian nation had defeated a European one in open battle, decisively, completely. The world was still adjusting to what that meant. Most of the diplomats and military attachés standing in that garden did not fully understand it yet. Some of them would not understand it for another 36 years, until a Sunday morning in December when the lesson would be repeated in a harbour called Pearl. Officers from foreign navies had been invited. Young American officers, Nimitz among them, were sent to represent the United States. They arrived late. They sat at a table near the exit. They drank captured Russian champagne and watched the crowd the way young officers watch crowds at events they do not fully belong to, with interest and a certain quiet awareness that they are standing at the edge of something larger than themselves. Toward the end of the party, they saw an old man making his way toward the exit. Small, build, Admiral's uniform, moving through the room the way a man moves when the evening is over and he has said everything he came to say. It was Togo. The midshipman held a quick vote. Nimitz was elected to intercept him. He stood up, walked over, introduced himself, and invited the most famous naval commander in the world to their table. Togo smiled. He came over. He shook every hand. He sat down, sipped the Russian champagne, and talked with them in English for a few minutes. Not performing, not accepting reverence, just talking, the way a man talks when the work is done and he has nothing left to prove. Nimitz left no detailed contemporary record of what he and Togo said to each other that afternoon. Decades later, he would publicly recall the meeting, the handshake, the champagne, the brief conversation in English. But whatever deeper impression a 57-year-old Japanese admiral left on a 20-year-old American midshipman in a garden in Tokyo in the summer of 1905 that stayed with Nimitz in a place where words did not reach. You know it stayed with him. You know it because of what he did later. You know it because of a funeral in 1934, and a shipyard in 1945, and a check written in 1958, and a garden built in Texas 10 years after he was dead. Some things you carry for the rest of your life. He carried that afternoon. Now the ship. Mikasa was not built in Japan. In 1899, Japan did not yet have the industrial capacity to build a pre-dreadnought battleship of that class. The ship was built in England, at the Vickers Yard in Barrow-in-Furness, on the northwest coast of Cumbria. Her keel was laid down on the 24th of January, 1899. She was launched in 1900. She was commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy on the 1st of March, 1902. 3 years later, she led the line at Tsushima, with Togo standing on her bridge. And then, on the night of September 11th, 1905, a week after the Treaty of Portsmouth was signed and the war was officially over, a fire broke out aboard the Mikasa in the harbour at Sasebo. It reached the aft magazine. The explosion broke her back. She sank at her moorings. 251 crewmen died. Think about that for a moment. 251 sailors who had survived the largest naval battle since Trafalgar, killed by an accident in port a few months later. Men who had stood at their guns while Russian shells tore through the superstructure. Men who had watched 21 enemy ships go down. Men who had gone home to their families and written letters saying they had made it through. dead in their bunks from a fire that started after the fighting was over. Some wars end that way. Some ships carry that kind of weight. The Japanese raised her. They repaired her at Sasebo. They put her back into service. She served through the First World War. She patrolled during the intervention in Siberia in the early 1920s. And in 1923, under the terms of the Washington Naval Treaty, the agreement that tried to limit the size of the world's battle fleets, Mikasa was decommissioned. The Japanese government did not scrap her. At their request, the signatory nations agreed that Mikasa could be preserved as a memorial ship. Her hull was set in concrete at Yokosuka. Her decks were open to the public on the 12th of November 1926. The ceremony was presided over by Crown Prince Hirohito. He was 25 years old. He would within months become the Emperor of Japan. Standing beside him, in retirement, in his Admiral's uniform, was Togo Heihachiro, 78 years old. Looking at his old ship for what he must have known would be one of the last times. The bridge where he had stood at Tsushima, the deck where 251 of his men had died in their sleep, the hull that had carried him through the engagement that changed what the world believed was possible. He would die 8 years later. And a captain in the United States Navy, who had once shaken his hand over Russian champagne, would make a point of honoring him in a way that no protocol required. On the 30th of May 1934, Admiral Togo Heihachiro died in Tokyo. He was 86 years old. His funeral was a national event. Hundreds of thousands of mourners filled the streets of Tokyo for the public procession on the 5th of June. State honors, military ceremony, a grief that moved through the country the way grief moves through a country when the man who dies is not just a commander, but a symbol of what the nation believes about itself. Chester Nimitz was 49 years old. He was a captain serving aboard the heavy cruiser USS Augusta in the Western Pacific. The Augusta was in Tokyo Bay when the news came. On the morning of the funeral, the ship fired 19 guns at 1-minute intervals in honor of the dead admiral. American sailors in dress uniform, a company of the tallest Marines and bluejackets aboard, were sent ashore to march in the procession alongside delegations from every major navy in the world. Nimitz went ashore with Admiral Upham. He attended the public funeral, and then he did something that went beyond what the ceremony required of a serving American captain. He attended the family funeral as well, the private service, the one reserved for those closest to the dead man. He did not explain why. He did not issue a statement. He did not tell reporters. 29 years had passed since that afternoon in the garden. Nimitz had gone from midshipman to submarine commander to instructor, to war college student, to bureau chief, to captain. He had moved through every stage of a naval career, and though he would later speak publicly about meeting Togo, at the time of the funeral he offered no explanation for why he went beyond what duty required. But when Togo died, Nimitz went to both funerals, the one the protocol required and the one it did not. That was June of 1934. 7 years later, the country whose greatest Admiral Nimitz had just honored would send 353 aircraft across the Pacific on a Sunday morning and turn the harbor at Pearl into a graveyard. And the man who would be sent to fight the war that followed, the man who would be given the impossible job of rebuilding a shattered fleet and taking it back across 4,000 miles of ocean to the doorstep of the empire that had struck the blow, would be the same man who had stood at Togo's funeral and paid respects that no one had asked him to pay. December 7th, 1941. Sunday morning. The attack hit Pearl Harbor at 7:48. By the time the smoke cleared, 8 battleships were sunk or damaged. 188 aircraft were destroyed. 2,403 Americans were dead. The Pacific Fleet's battleship force had been devastated. Its aircraft carriers, by fortune of scheduling, had been at sea. Its submarines, its cruisers, its destroyers were still operational. But the psychological blow was absolute. The fleet that had anchored in that harbor as a symbol of American power in the Pacific had been struck in a single morning, and the men who survived it walked through the wreckage, knowing that everything they had believed about their own safety had been wrong. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox flew to Hawaii, saw the damage, and sent a message back to Washington that would end up defining the next 4 years of Chester Nimitz's life. The message was blunt. It was the kind of sentence that only gets written when there is no time left for anything but the truth. Tell Nimitz to get the hell out to Pearl and stay there till the war is won. Nimitz arrived on Christmas Day. He was 56 years old. He took command of what was left. The harbor still smelled like burnt oil. The water was still black with it. The hulls of the Arizona and the Oklahoma were still visible beneath the surface. The battleship fleet that had been the backbone of American naval planning for a generation was gone, and the enemy he had been sent to destroy was the navy of the country, whose greatest admiral he had honored, whose hand he had shaken, whose funeral he had attended, whose flagship he had studied since he was 20 years old. Nimitz respected Togo. He had studied Tsushima thoroughly. But the war he was about to fight would bear almost no resemblance to the battle Togo had won 40 years earlier. The victories that would come at Midway, at the Philippine Sea, at Leyte Gulf would emerge from decades of American naval planning, from intelligence breakthroughs, from carrier doctrine that did not exist in Togo's era, from submarine warfare on a scale the world had never seen, and from the decisions of dozens of commanders across thousands of miles of ocean. What Nimitz carried from Togo was not a set of tactics. It was something older and simpler, a standard of conduct, a way of being a naval officer. The rest he would have to build himself. He never talked about the contradiction of fighting the heirs of the man he admired. He never mentioned Togo in any wartime dispatch. Whatever reconciliation he made between admiration and duty, between the memory of a handshake in 1905 and the reality of a war that would kill hundreds of thousands, he made it in silence. But the contradiction was there. It was there on every chart he studied. It was there in every operation order he signed. It was there every time a submarine reported another Japanese ship sinking beneath the Pacific, another crew going down in water so deep that no one would ever find them. He was fighting the heirs of the man he admired most in his profession, and he was fighting them with everything he had, because that was the job. And Chester Nimitz had never in his life failed to do the job. What came next would take 4 years, 2 million men, 1,000 ships, and a string of decisions made from a desk at Pearl Harbor that would determine whether the United States Navy lived or died in the Pacific. And at the end of it, on an afternoon at Yokosuka, with the surrender ceremony less than a day away, he would walk up to a rotting battleship in concrete and make a decision that had nothing to do with winning, and everything to do with what a man carries inside him when the winning is done. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Chester Nimitz made the decision that would define his war. It was the end of May 1942. The Pacific Fleet was still rebuilding. The battleships that had survived December 7th were either under repair or reassigned. What Nimitz had left were 3 aircraft carriers, a handful of cruisers, a screen of destroyers, and a piece of intelligence that his codebreakers told him was reliable. The Japanese were coming to Midway, 4 fleet carriers, the same carriers that had launched the strike on Pearl Harbor. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. The most experienced carrier striking force in the world, commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the same officer who had led the attack 6 months earlier. Behind Nagumo was the rest of the combined fleet, including battleships and cruisers under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself, the architect of the Pearl Harbor operation, the man who had warned his own government that he could run wild for 6 months, and after that he could guarantee nothing. 6 months had passed. Yamamoto was coming to finish what he had started. Nimitz had 3 carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Yorktown had been damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea 3 weeks earlier and had limped back to Pearl Harbor with a hole in her flight deck and damage to her hull that the yard estimated would take 90 days to repair. Nimitz gave them 72 hours. The yard crews worked around the clock. Yorktown sailed on the 30th of May with welding torches still cooling on her lower decks. The intelligence came from a unit called Station Hypo, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort. They had been breaking the Japanese naval code, JN-25, for months. They knew the target. They knew the approximate date. They knew the composition of the striking force. What they could not tell Nimitz was exactly where Nagumo's carriers would be at the moment of contact, or whether the Japanese had changed their plans since the last intercept. Nimitz trusted the intelligence. He positioned his 3 carriers northeast of Midway, outside the range of Japanese reconnaissance, and waited. He was betting the war. If the intelligence was wrong, if the Japanese were not coming to Midway, if they had changed course or shifted their objective, Nimitz would have sent his last 3 carriers into empty ocean while the enemy struck somewhere else. There would be no recovery from that. The Pacific Fleet would be finished. If the intelligence was right, 3 American carriers against 4 Japanese carriers, with the element of surprise on the American side, might be enough. Not a comfortable margin, not a guaranteed outcome, just enough. On the morning of June 4th, the Japanese struck Midway with their aircraft. Nagumo's carriers launched their first wave at dawn, and while those planes were hitting the island, the American carriers, undetected, launched everything they had. The first wave of American torpedo bombers was slaughtered. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet. 15 aircraft. 14 were shot down. Every man in those 14 planes was killed. One survived. Ensign George Gay, floating in the water in his life vest, watched what happened next. The torpedo bombers had come in low and slow, and the Japanese fighters had come down to meet them. The combat air patrol was on the water, and at that moment the American dive bombers arrived from above. In 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers were burning. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, hit while their flight decks were loaded with aircraft being armed and refueled. The explosions moved through the hangars the way fire moves through a building with no exits. Fuel, ordnance, aviation, gasoline, all of it going off in a chain that could not be stopped. Hiryu survived long enough to launch a counterstrike that found the Yorktown and hit her with bombs and torpedoes. She would sink 3 days later, but Hiryu did not survive the afternoon. American dive bombers found her and put her down the same way they had put down the other 3. 4 Japanese fleet carriers sunk in a single day. The striking force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months was gone. The war had turned. Nimitz received the reports at Pearl Harbor. He did not celebrate. He noted the losses. He noted what had worked. He noted what had failed. He began planning the next operation. That was how he fought. Not from the bridge of a flagship in the old style, the way Togo had fought at Tsushima. From a desk, reading dispatches that arrived hours after the events they described, making decisions based on information that was always incomplete and sometimes wrong. The weight of it was different from what Togo had carried. Togo could see the enemy. He could see his own ships. He could watch the shells fall and know in real time whether the line was holding or breaking. Nimitz could see nothing. He could only read and think and decide and wait. And the waiting was the worst part, because in the waiting there was nothing to do except imagine what was happening to the men he had sent. That was Midway, the battle that proved Nimitz could win. What came after proved something else. It proved he could endure what winning cost. The submarine campaign was not a single battle. It was a decision that played out over 3 years across every shipping lane in the Western Pacific. Nimitz had been a submarine officer early in his career. He understood what submarines could do, and what he ordered them to do was simple to describe and terrible to execute. Cut Japan off. Japan was an island nation that depended on imported oil, imported rice, imported iron, imported rubber, imported everything. The merchant fleet that carried those supplies across the Pacific was Japan's lifeline. Without it, the factories stopped. The ships could not sail. The planes could not fly. The army could not eat. Nimitz sent his submarines into those shipping lanes with orders to sink everything that floated under a Japanese flag. Tankers, freighters, transports, fishing vessels, when the war reached its final stages and there was nothing else left to sink. He did not make exceptions. He did not slow down. He did not modify the campaign when the reports began to show what it was doing to the civilian population of Japan. By late 1944, American submarines had inflicted catastrophic losses on Japanese merchant shipping. Working alongside mines, aircraft, and surface ships, the broader campaign had reduced Japan's vital imports of oil and raw materials to a fraction of what the war economy required. The home islands were being strangled, and the submarines had done more of the strangling than any other single weapon. The crews who carried out this campaign paid for it. Submarines in the Pacific had the highest casualty rate of any branch of the United States military. 52 submarines were lost, 3,700 men. 1 in 5 submariners who went on patrol did not come back. They sailed into waters where the enemy was hunting them with depth charges and aircraft and mines, and they did their work, and some of them came home, and some of them did not, and the ones who did not come home went down in water so deep and so dark that no one would ever reach them. Nimitz signed the orders that sent them there. He read the reports when the boats did not return. He knew their names. He knew their captains. He knew which lanes they had been assigned, and which ones were the most dangerous, and he sent them anyway, because that was the job, and the job was to win the war. And winning the war meant cutting off the enemy's ability to fight, and the submarines were the blade that did the cutting. He was not gentle about it. He could not afford to be. Every tanker that got through meant fuel for Japanese aircraft. Every freighter that survived meant ammunition for Japanese garrisons on islands that American Marines would have to take at bayonet point. The submarine campaign saved American lives on beaches from Tarawa to Iwo Jima by destroying the supplies that would have made those defenses even stronger than they were. That is the calculus of command. It is not clean. It is not comfortable. It is not the kind of arithmetic you explain to anyone who has not had to do it. Nimitz did it every day for 3.5 years, and he did not talk about it afterward, and he did not write about it, and when the war was over, he filed his report and named what had worked and what had failed, and he did not name the men responsible for the failures, because that was not his way. Then came Okinawa. April through June 1945, the last major campaign, before the invasion of the home islands that everyone believed was coming. Okinawa was close enough to Japan that the enemy could reach the invasion fleet with everything they had left. And what they had left in the spring of 1945 was the kamikaze. They came in waves. Young men, most of them in their early 20s, some of them teenagers, flying aircraft loaded with explosives directly into American ships. They did not try to pull up. They did not try to survive. They came in at angles that made them difficult to hit, and they aimed for the bridge, or the flight deck, or the waterline. And when they struck, the explosion went through the ship in a way that conventional bombs did not, because the aircraft itself was part of the weapon, fuel and metal and velocity, and all of it arriving at once. During the Okinawa campaign, Japanese air attacks, the kamikaze's chief among them, sank roughly 3 dozen American ships and craft, and damaged hundreds more. More than 9,000 naval casualties were recorded over the course of the campaign. The destroyers on radar picket duty, the small ships stationed at the outer edge of the fleet to give early warning of incoming attacks, took the worst of it. They were the first targets the kamikazes saw, and they were the last line before the carriers and the transports. Their crews stood at their guns and fired until the ammunition was gone, or the ship was gone, or they were gone. Nimitz received those reports at his headquarters. Every ship lost, every crew killed, every destroyer that went down on the picket line with its guns still firing. He read the casualty lists, and he processed them the way a man processes information that is unbearable but necessary, by turning it into decisions. More air cover, more ammunition, more picket ships to replace the ones that had been sunk. The machine had to keep running. The campaign had to continue. The island had to be taken. By the time Okinawa was secured, the numbers were final. 12,000 Americans dead on land and at sea, more than 100,000 Japanese military dead, an estimated 100,000 Okinawan civilians dead, caught between the two armies in a battle that turned every village and every ridge and every cave into a killing ground. Nimitz said nothing about it publicly. He filed his report. He counted the cost. And somewhere in the process of counting, in the act of reading one more casualty list from one more destroyer that had gone down under a kamikaze strike, something settled in him that would show up 4 months later at a shipyard in Yokosuka when he looked at a rotting battleship and made a decision that had nothing to do with strategy. He had spent 4 years destroying the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had done it thoroughly, professionally, and without sentiment. He had sunk their carriers at Midway. He had starved their fleet with submarines. He had burned their pilots out of the sky over the Philippine Sea. He had watched their last desperate weapon, the kamikaze, spend itself against his fleet at Okinawa. And through all of it, from the first submarine patrol order to the last casualty report, he had never once confused the act of fighting with the act of hating. That distinction mattered. It was about to matter more than anything else in this story. Tokyo Bay, September 2nd, 1945. 9 in the morning. The sky was grey. The water was calm. The USS Missouri, one of the newest battleships in the American fleet, sat at anchor in a harbour that 4 years earlier had been the beating heart of an empire that reached from Manchuria to the Solomon Islands. Her decks were crowded. Sailors packed the superstructure. Officers in dress whites lined the rails. 250 correspondents, photographers, and newsreel cameramen were positioned at every angle the ship's geometry allowed. Every major news outlet in the world was represented. This was the moment. This was the frame that would go into the archives and the textbooks and the memory of a generation. The Japanese delegation would arrive by launch in a few minutes. The surrender documents were on the table. The pens were in place. Chester Nimitz was not happy. He had said so. Not to reporters. Nimitz did not speak to reporters if he could avoid it. He had said it to Admiral Ernest King in Washington and to the officers around him. He had said his piece in the way he always said his piece, flat, direct, without theatre, and then he had let it go. His objection was real. An army general was about to preside over the surrender ceremony of a war that had been fought island by island, reef by reef, across the width of the Pacific Ocean by the United States Navy and the United States Marine Corps. The sailors who had gone down with their ships in the Black Water off Guadalcanal. The Marines who had died on the beaches at Tarawa, at Peleliu, at Iwo Jima. The submariners who had sailed into Japanese shipping lanes and never come back. The destroyer crews who had stood at their guns on the picket line at Okinawa while the kamikazes came in and did not stop coming. The Pacific War had been, from December of 41 to the summer of 45, a naval war, and an army general was going to stand at the microphone. Nimitz did not fight it. He was not that kind of officer. He had said what he thought to the people who needed to hear it, and then he had put on his dress uniform and shown up to do his job. Douglas MacArthur was 65 years old that morning. He stepped to the table where the surrender documents were waiting. He had planned this. Every part of it. He used several pens during the signing, handing the first to Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright. Wainwright was 62. He had been left behind in the Philippines in April of 42 when MacArthur was ordered out. He had surrendered Corregidor. He had spent 3.5 years in Japanese prison camps in Manchuria. He arrived at the ceremony that morning so thin that his uniform hung off his shoulders like it belonged to a larger man. His hair had gone white. His hands shook. MacArthur handed him the first pen. Another went to Lieutenant General Arthur Percival of the British Army. Percival had surrendered Singapore in February of 42. He had also spent the war in Japanese captivity. The remaining pens were set aside as historic mementos, destined for institutions and family. MacArthur spoke for 4 minutes. Then the Japanese signed. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, in a top hat and morning coat, leaning on a cane, because he had lost his left leg to an assassin's bomb in Shanghai in 1932. General Yoshijiro Umezu, in full military uniform, his face showing nothing. Then it was Nimitz. He walked to the table. There were 2 copies of the instrument of surrender, one for the Allies and one for the Japanese. He signed both, using a presentation pen from a friend for one copy, and his own green Parker pen for the other. There was no theatre in it, no speech, no pause for the cameras. He signed and stepped away. The whole thing took less than a minute. A correspondent covering the ceremony wrote that evening that Nimitz signed and withdrew so quickly that it was easy to miss he had been there at all. 4 minutes for MacArthur, perhaps 40 seconds for Nimitz. The ceremony ended. The Japanese delegation returned to the launch. MacArthur's aircraft lifted off toward Tokyo, where he would set up his headquarters as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers. He would run Japan from an office building in the center of the city. Japanese newspapers would begin calling him the blue-eyed shogun. That was not entirely a compliment. After the ceremony, Nimitz returned to his forward headquarters at Guam to complete his wartime command responsibilities before returning to the United States. Here is what you did not read about in any newspaper that fall. While MacArthur was settling into his office in Tokyo, Nimitz was working on the final report. Several hundred pages, every major campaign from December 7th, 1941 to August 15th, 1945. Every operation, every decision, every failure. He named what had worked and why. He named what had failed and why. He did not name the men responsible for the failures. That was not his way. He finished it. He submitted it to the Navy Department in Washington. It was filed. There was no press conference. There was no ceremony. There was no interview. Nimitz did not mention it to anyone. He never did. On the 15th of December 1945, Chester Nimitz was sworn in as Chief of Naval Operations. President Truman had nominated him. The Senate had confirmed him. He took the job because the job was offered, and he had never in his life refused an assignment the Navy asked him to take. He would hold the position for exactly 2 years. He would hate almost every day of it. Washington, in the late 1940s, was not the war he had just won. It was budget hearings. It was congressional testimony. It was inter-service fights about which branch would fly which aircraft off which ship. The Army Air Forces were pushing to become their own service, the United States Air Force. The National Security Act of 1947 would reorganize the entire American military establishment. And a great deal of that reorganization was a fight over funding and prestige and territory that had nothing to do with winning wars and everything to do with winning arguments in rooms where the stakes were measured in budget lines and committee votes. The Navy was being cut. At the peak of the war, the United States Navy had roughly 3.5 million men in uniform. By the time Nimitz stepped down, that number would be under 500,000. Ships were being decommissioned by the hundreds. Fleets that had been assembled at enormous cost, fleets that had crossed the Pacific and won the largest naval war in human history, were being sold for scrap or mothballed at anchor in bays up and down the American coast. Nimitz had to manage the contraction of the most powerful naval force ever assembled, while simultaneously arguing in front of politicians who had already made up their minds that the future of warfare belonged to the Air Force and the atomic bomb, and that carriers and battleships were relics of a war that was already over. He told Catherine he hated it. Catherine was 53. They had been married since 1913. She was the one person he told the truth to about the job. He did not hate Washington, the city. He had lived there before. What he hated was what the work had become. At Pearl Harbor, sitting at his desk with the harbor, still smelling of oil from the ships that had burned, every decision he made had a consequence he could trace. A submarine patrol order meant men going into enemy waters. A carrier deployment meant pilots over targets. A wrong decision meant Americans died. A right decision meant the enemy's ships went down instead of his. The weight was terrible, but it was honest. In Washington, a wrong decision meant a budget line moved 3% in the wrong direction. A right decision meant a committee chairman felt respected enough to support a piece of legislation that might preserve funding for a class of destroyer that might be built in a shipyard in a state that the chairman happened to represent. He had spent 4 years making decisions that determined whether young Americans lived or died. Now he was in rooms where the argument was about carrier-based aviation versus land-based aviation, and whether a particular flag officer was going to keep his star. He stayed because the job required him to stay. Nimitz was not a man who walked away from what the job required, but he did not stay 1 day longer than the job demanded. On the 15th of December 1947, exactly 2 years to the day after he had taken office, he handed the position to Admiral Louis Denfeld. He said what needed to be said. He shook the hands that needed to be shaken. He walked out of the building. No farewell dinner arranged for the cameras, no memoir announced, no board of directors, no consulting firm, no lecture circuit, no television appearances, nothing. He flew to California. He and Catherine settled in Berkeley. For the first time in decades, he lived in a house that did not come with a command. He walked every morning. He tended a garden. He read. By the accounts of the people around him in those years, He was, for the first time in a long time, at ease. He did not give speeches about what the war had meant. He did not appear on television to explain the decisions he had made. He did not write his memoirs. Publishers asked. He declined. Reporters called. He had nothing to say. The war was over. The report was filed. The decisions had been made, and the consequences had been counted, and whatever needed to be said about any of it was in the record, where it belonged. He was done, and 5,000 miles away, sitting in concrete at the edge of Yokosuka harbor, a battleship named Mikasa was rotting in the salt air, waiting for something that had not happened yet, waiting for a letter that had not been written, waiting for an old man in California to pick up a pen one more time, not to sign a surrender document, not to authorize a submarine patrol, not to order a fleet across an ocean, to write a check. For 10 years after the war, Mikasa sat in her concrete berth at Yokosuka, and nobody came to save her. The guards Nimitz had posted in 1945 had helped prevent the worst of the vandalism in the first weeks of occupation, but the ship's survival came at a cost. The Soviet demand for Mikasa's complete destruction was not simply rejected. It was resolved through a compromise that left the ship standing, but stripped of nearly everything that had made her a warship: turrets, guns, masts, funnels, and most of her upper works were removed as part of her disarmament. What remained was a hull in concrete, recognizable as a ship only in outline. The years passed, and she was not repaired. She sat in the salt air and the rain and the typhoon seasons that swept across Tokyo Bay every autumn, and she corroded the way steel corrodes when no one is paying attention. Slowly at first, then everywhere at once. Her paint failed, her decks warped, rust moved through her plating in streaks that looked from a distance like wounds that would not close. And then it got worse. At some point in the late 1940s, the ship was turned over to a private company. What they did with Togo's flagship tells you everything you need to know about what defeat looks like when the cameras have moved on. They built a dance hall on the main deck, a large barn-like structure nailed together over the teak planking, where Togo's officers had stood during the greatest naval engagement since Trafalgar. They called it Club Mikasa. American sailors from the base at Yokosuka came aboard on Saturday nights to drink and dance on the deck of the ship that had led the Japanese line at Tsushima. Some of the old hands called it Café Togo, a cheap bar with cheap entertainment on the flagship of an empire that no longer existed. Below decks, where the crew had slept and the ammunition had been stored, and 251 men had died in a magazine explosion. In September of 1905, they installed an aquarium, fish tanks in the hull of a memorial ship, a dance floor on the bridge deck of the vessel that had changed the balance of power in the Pacific half a century earlier. Beer sold on the quarterdeck, where the emperor's portrait had once hung. The club failed, the aquarium failed, the company walked away, and Mikasa was left alone again, worse than before. Stripped, converted, abandoned, rusting at the edge of a harbor that now belonged to the United States Navy. That is where she was when a man from Barrow-in-Furness changed everything. John S. Reuben was a British-born businessman living in the United States. He remembered seeing the Mikasa launched and completed at the Vickers Yard at Barrow-in-Furness as a young man, watching the finest warship the yard had ever produced slide down the ways and into the water. That memory had stayed with him for more than half a century. 55 years later, in 1955, Reuben visited Japan on business. He went to Yokosuka. He found the ship he remembered from boyhood. What he saw, he could not leave alone. He wrote a letter to the Nippon Times. It was published on the 24th of September, 1955. He described what he had found. The hull still recognizable from the outside, but the interior, in his words, a shambles, ghost-like in its decrepitude. He wrote that the Mikasa was to Japan what HMS Victory was to Britain, and that no nation that understood its own history would allow such a ship to decay into nothing. That letter landed in Japan the way a stone lands in still water. The ripples moved outward. Newspapers picked it up. Former naval officers read it. Historians read it. Men who had served in the war, men who had spent the last 10 years in the particular silence that surrounds the defeated, read it and recognized in it something they had been unable to say themselves. It is difficult for a defeated nation to argue for the preservation of its own military symbols. It sounds like defiance. It sounds like nostalgia for the thing that brought the defeat. But when a foreigner says it, when a man from the very country that built the ship says this vessel matters, the argument changes. By 1957, a public interest campaign was building. By 1958, the Mikasa Preservation Society had been reconstituted. Money was being raised, but not enough. There was talk of scrapping what was left and being done with it. The ship was too far gone. The cost was too high. Japan had other priorities. The economy was growing. The country was rebuilding. Factories, roads, schools, hospitals. A rusting battleship in a concrete berth was not what the future required. The Preservation Society needed something money alone could not buy. They needed a name. They needed someone whose voice would carry weight on both sides of the Pacific. Someone the Americans would not dismiss. Someone the Japanese would trust. There was one man alive who fit both descriptions. They wrote to Chester Nimitz in California. Nimitz was 72 years old. He had been retired for 11 years. He was not looking for a project. He had no obligation to the men who had written to him. He had no obligation to Japan. He had earned, by any measure a man can be measured by, the right to spend the rest of his years exactly the way he wanted to spend them. He read the letter. He did not consult anyone. He did not issue a statement. He did not hold a press conference. He sat down and wrote a series of essays for the restoration campaign. Then he took the fees he was paid for those essays, every dollar, and donated them to the Mikasa Restoration Fund. It was the first contribution the fund received from an American. And then he did the second thing, the thing that mattered more than the money. He put his name on it. He authorized the campaign to say publicly that Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, United States Navy, the man who had accepted the Japanese surrender at Tokyo Bay, the man who had commanded the destruction of the Imperial Japanese Navy across 4 years and 4,000 miles of ocean, supported the preservation of the flagship of the greatest admiral that Navy had ever produced. That was a door opening that no amount of money could have opened. Once Nimitz's name was on it, others followed. Former Pacific Fleet officers, enlisted men who had served under him, veterans who had fought against the Japanese Navy, and who now, quietly, without explaining themselves, sent money to help save one of that Navy's ships. The United States government returned the parts of Mikasa that had been removed and held in storage since 1945. And in a shipyard in Japan, the Chilean battleship Almirante La Torre, also built in England, was being scrapped. Her steel and her fittings provided the parts that would rebuild Mikasa's superstructure. Japanese shipwrights and craftsmen did the work. They rebuilt what the war and the occupation and 10 years of neglect and one failed dance hall had taken away. The guns were replaced with replicas. The bridge was restored. The interior was returned, as closely as the available materials allowed, to the condition of 1905. On the 27th of May, 1961, 56 years to the day after the Battle of Tsushima, 56 years after Togo had stood on that same bridge, and ordered his fleet across the head of the Russian line. The Mikasa reopened as a museum ship at Yokosuka. Chester Nimitz did not attend the reopening. He was 75 years old. His health was beginning to fail. He followed it from California. He received letters of thanks. He answered them the way he answered everything, briefly and without embellishment. On the 20th of February, 1966, Chester William Nimitz died. He was 80 years old. In his final years, as his health declined, he and Catherine had moved into Navy quarters on Yerba Buena Island in the middle of San Francisco Bay, close enough to the water to hear it, quiet enough that the last years could pass in peace. He had suffered a series of strokes. Catherine was with him at the end. His funeral was by his own instructions, simple. No state ceremony, no procession, no cameras. He was buried at the Golden Gate National Cemetery in San Bruno, California. Beside him, by his own request, were long-time naval comrades, among them Admiral Raymond Spruance, who had commanded the fleet at Midway, and Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, who had led the submarine force that had done so much of the war's hardest work. These were not men of equal rank. They were men of equal weight. Men who understood what the job had been because they had done it too. The wire services carried the news. The world noted it and moved on. But at the funeral, standing at the graveside in California, in an American cemetery in dress uniform, were representatives of the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, officers of the Navy that had risen from the ashes of the one Nimitz had destroyed. They had come to pay their respects to the man who had defeated them and then saved something they could not have saved themselves. They stood at attention. They said nothing that was recorded. They left. A year after he died in 1967, a bronze statue of Togo was placed on the grounds at Yokosuka beside the Mikasa. His uniform, his sword, his face cast in metal looking out toward the harbor, a man Nimitz had first seen in a garden in 1905, a man whose Navy Nimitz had spent 4 years destroying, a man whose ship Nimitz had saved twice, once with a guard detail in 1945, and once with his name in 1958. Nimitz never saw the statue, but the statue stands within sight of the ship, and the ship stands because of him. Now one more thing, because the story is not quite done. May 1976, 10 years after Nimitz died. Fredericksburg, Texas, a small town in the hill country, west of Austin, sitting in a landscape of live oaks and cedar and rolling limestone hills that does not look like the Pacific and does not sound like the Pacific and has no reason to be connected to the largest naval war in human history except for one thing. Chester Nimitz was born there in 1885. His grandfather had run a hotel on Main Street, the Nimitz Hotel. Locals called it the Steamboat Hotel because the old man had built it in the shape of a ship's prow, complete with a wooden bridge on top. A strange building for a landlocked town in Texas, but it said something about the family. The sea was already in them before there was any reason for it to be. After the war, the town had built a museum around the old hotel. They called it the Admiral Nimitz Museum. It told the story of the Pacific War. It told the story of the man who had commanded it on the American side. And in May of 1976, something was dedicated on the grounds of that museum that had not been there before. A Japanese garden, not a small decorative feature, not a token gesture, a full traditional Japanese garden, designed with the kind of precision and care that takes years to plan and cannot be faked. Stone lanterns, a meditation stream, carefully shaped plantings, placed according to principles that are centuries old, and at its center, a structure modeled on the study of Admiral Togo Heihachiro at his home in Tokyo. The Garden of Peace was designed by Japanese landscape architect Taketora Saito. It was funded by donations raised in Japan, with support from the Japanese government, and built by Japanese craftsmen who travelled to Fredericksburg to create the garden stone by stone as a gift honouring the connection between Nimitz and Togo and the reconciliation between two nations that had once tried to destroy each other. They called it the Garden of Peace. Nimitz never saw it. He never knew it was coming. He had been dead for 10 years. His name was on the museum next door. His grandfather's hotel still stood on Main Street. And in the garden, the water moved over the stones, the way water moves in every Japanese garden in the world, with a sound that is designed to make you stop and listen and think about how things that seem impossible become real. It is still there today. You can drive to Fredericksburg and walk through it. You can sit on a stone bench under a live oak in the Texas Hill Country and listen to water that was placed there as an act of reconciliation by people from the nation Nimitz had defeated. You can look at the study modelled after Togo's and think about how it got there. A Japanese room in a Texas town, built as a gift from Japan to America, for an admiral who never asked for monuments, because of another admiral he met in a garden 60 years before any of it made sense. In 2009, 48 years after Mikasa reopened, the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz, CVN-68, named after the man who had started all of this, with a guard detail in 1945, was deployed to the Western Pacific. Her sailors volunteered to repaint the hull of the Mikasa. American sailors, on a carrier bearing his name, painting the ship he had saved. The circle does not get more complete than that. The Mikasa sits today at Mikasa Park in Yokosuka, just outside the gates of Commander Fleet Activities, Yokosuka, the largest American naval installation in the Western Pacific, home port of the United States 7th Fleet. The country that spent 4 years trying to sink the Imperial Japanese Navy now maintains its primary Pacific presence within sight of that Navy's most famous flagship. Every year on the 27th of May, the anniversary of Tsushima, the commander of United States Naval Forces Japan, goes aboard the Mikasa. Officers of the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force join him. Two navies that spent 4 years trying to destroy each other, standing together on the deck of a ship that one of them built and one of them helped save. Chester Nimitz was not a gentleman. He was not a sentimental man. He sent submarines to cut off an enemy's food and fuel. He oversaw campaigns that killed tens of thousands. He prosecuted 4 years of war with the sole objective of defeating an empire as completely and as quickly as possible. He did not forget Bataan. He did not forget the prison camps. He did not forget what had been done in China, in the Philippines, on the islands. He was not gentle about any of it. What he was finished when it was finished. That is a different thing entirely. Some men need to keep the battlefield after the battle is over. They need to stand on it and point to where they stood. They need the speeches and the ceremonies and the monuments built in their own image. Nimitz came home from the biggest naval war in history, and the most visible thing he left behind in his own country was a museum in a Texas town he had left as a boy. A museum about the war, not about himself. The most visible thing he left behind in Japan was a ship that belonged to the old admiral he had first seen in a garden in Tokyo in the summer of 1905, when he was 20 years old and the century was young, and neither of them knew yet what the next 40 years would ask of them. That old admiral had said something at a hospital bedside in Sasebo in June of 1905, to a beaten Russian officer whose fleet he had just crushed at Tsushima. Defeat is the common fate of a soldier. There is nothing to be ashamed of in it. The great point is whether we have performed our duty. Nimitz would have been 20 years old when those words were spoken. He probably read them in one of the newspaper accounts that circulated through the fleet later that summer. Some things you carry for the rest of your life. He carried that. And when the war was over, and the papers were signed, and the man who had said those words had been dead for 11 years, and the ship he had commanded was sitting in concrete at the edge of a harbour waiting to be forgotten, Chester Nimitz walked up to it and gave the order that kept it alive.